Okay, so if we can start now and you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Barney Jordaan. I'm born in South Africa. I've been living in Belgium for the past 9 years. I'm a lawyer by training, was professor of law at Stellenbosch University for a number of years, and then became something of a academic, teaching at business schools and while running a consulting practice, also in the area of negotiation, mediation, employment relations, and so on. And since 2014, teaching negotiation, mediation, conflict resolution at a business school in Belgium.
Barney, if you can give us a little bit about your mediation background as well.
I started my mediation career in 1991, was trained by the then Independent Mediation Services of South Africa, IMSA, focusing predominantly on employment-related matters, workplace disputes, collective bargaining disputes. Eventually was part of the team that trained the first batch of commissioners for the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, Arbitration. Served as a senior part-time commissioner myself for a number of years, also with a number of bargaining councils. Then went on a program for commercial mediation, which I think around about 2002, I think around about there. So trained as a commercial mediator with conflict dynamics and also accredited with Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution in the UK. Certified mediator with the International Mediation Institute. Currently, because of my teaching loads, I don't get involved in too many mediations. I do some workplace mediations with the organization that I work for. But my plan is within the next year or two to get my hands dirty in practice again and to start doing more mediation work. I also am part of the training faculty for conflict dynamics, assessing mediators. I write on mediation, articles, book chapters, mediation, conflict resolution, dispute resolution. So that roughly is my background in mediation.
That's quite extensive. So, I mean, I'm sure you have a wealth of information to share with us. But my first question to you would be, would you consider yourself as an individual, basically located from South Africa, your positionality being from South Africa as an African mediator? And would you then say that your approach to mediation is impacted by particular ideals that are implicit to your cultural background?
Mm-hmm. To what extent do I still consider myself to be a mediator from Africa, and has that background influenced my approach to mediation? I think yes, absolutely. Does it make a difference to the way I mediate? I certainly think so. And I think the reason is simply this, that in South Africa, we had unique challenges, especially also in the area, not just politically, but also in the area of collective bargaining, trade union relations, and the like, which I think provides a good basis for understanding the dynamics of collective bargaining relationships in other contexts as well. I was also involved in the 1980s with a human rights firm, and then did some, let's call it dialogue and informal mediations for indigent people under the banner of the Stellenbosch Advice Office, as well as the legal firm. And there I think I realized that the law is not the best way of resolving disputes, especially in a context where people don't have rights or have very limited rights, and that's where dialogue and negotiation and mediating conflicts actually can thrive. And that has shaped me, that has shaped my approach to mediation. I take a very, let's call it, human-oriented view towards mediation, not just a purely transactional one, even with commercial mediations, trying to understand the parties involved and not just the issues involved. I also believe that let's call it a more African way of looking at conflict is more conducive to better negotiation outcomes. In other words, not just to see a conflict as a once-off event or a dispute as a once-off event that once it's solved, everything is okay, but that even though the dispute might be resolved, the conflict itself might not be over, and that mediators might, with the parties' permission, have a role to play in helping them reestablish their relationships beyond the actual dispute.
That certainly is very, very true, because African mediation demands more of a focus and attention towards positive peace. So in your experience, is there room for a mediator to channel their own values during the mediation process? I mean, because you've caught between two continents now, if I may say so. And so you're experiencing two different kind of environments. I'm pretty sure about that. So can a mediator then channel their own values during the mediation process? Or is there a tendency, for many people, like they just learn something by the book, they stick with the book and they follow those formats in their mediation? Or do you find that as an individual, you need to be far more flexible and that your own values does surface when you're in the mediation process?
To what extent do my own values affect my approach? Well, it depends on what one means. If by values we mean my own opinions, then I certainly think no. If it's about developing my own mediation style, absolutely. I think we are all trained by the book in terms of a formula of some sorts, mostly a facilitative model. But I think as one gains experience, you realize that the mediation is a flexible process. That instead of trying to fit the problem to the process, we need to fit the process to the problem. That means one has to be adaptable. But this means that you have to tread a very fine line between following your own approach and not taking the self-determination away from the parties. That ultimately is the objective, that the parties determine the outcome for themselves, but with as much help as they need and give consent to receiving. This might even mean that the mediator can, with the parties' consent, help them design the actual negotiation process, because mediation is negotiation through a third party. So the mediator can help the parties actually, first of all, design the process for dispute resolution before donning the hat of a mediator, and guiding them through that while always leaving it to them to find the result. This doesn't mean that the mediator can't provide feedback, challenge them in private sessions, do some reality checking, or with their permission, actually brainstorm some solutions with the parties together on how to resolve their dispute. In terms of values, I think that one should always carry with you. In other words, the value of maintaining confidentiality, of being impartial and independent of the dispute, and not to have private contact with the parties, to be truthful towards the parties. I think those values are constant, but one's approach may be flexible depending on the nature of the dispute and what the parties want.
So it's now almost 40 years later, if I may say, from 1980, when you were engaged in that indigenous consult with the human rights in the 1980s.
Well, it's more 1990.
Oh, 1990.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I trained as a mediator in 1990, but involved before then, absolutely.
Yes. So if you're looking back now, I mean, I'm sure there's a wealth of experience behind you now, hindsight, etc., things to look back. When you look back at that particular instance, it was a very volatile time in our country. Yes. It's a very sensitive issue that you were dealing with. Is there any anecdotal evidence that you have from there to say, what, this would have been done differently? I would have liked to have done this like this, or perhaps this should have been included. Do you reflect on that and use it then in the way that you have gone forward?
You're asking if there are things I would have done differently if I had the chance.
Yes, possibly.
In my mediation work or advisory work, well, I think first of all, I could have done much more, I'm sure. Could have been bolder in certain instances. With hindsight, I think, there's a time when, as you say, there was a lot of tension. There were very few coherent processes available at the time, or rather, we didn't come together as a group to say, how do we collectively tackle these challenges? It was very much an individual thing. roll up your sleeves and help out without being properly trained, with not always understanding the context, not always taking account of cultural differences, sometimes maybe imposing a process instead of negotiating the process itself. So yeah, certainly a lot that could have been done at that stage, but I still believe that ultimately, there's formal justice through the courts and arbitrators, and then there is what one can call kind of a subjective justice, which is the result of dialogue and negotiation and maybe mediation efforts, where people come up with a result that actually works for them. It's not contrary to the law. It still happens within the bounds of the law, but it's not a legally designed or legally provided answer. It's an answer that actually helps the parties in the moment to resolve a particular dispute. But none of those were necessarily lasting. For the agreements that were reached to be lasting, you actually needed far more follow-up, you needed more capacity, and probably a legal framework that allows for if not follow-up, then some kind of sanctions for non-compliance with whatever has been agreed. So I think a lot of lessons learned. Would I do it again? Oh, absolutely. Because I think that is, one way of contributing to making a small difference to people's lives is if you can help them with the things that they really care about day to day, whether it's accommodation, a job on a farm, harassment by security police and others. Those are their immediate concerns. So that I would certainly do again if I had the opportunity.
This is tremendous. I see that, yes, you raise a lot of things about the mediation process, and we'll come to that again. But if I ask you very quickly, if you look at your mediation style, your mediation approach, etc., what do you think is your preferred approach to mediation, and what do you prioritize in the mediation process? I know many mediators have different styles, and they focus on certain things. They want to just get the job done. Others say no, it's more about satisfying the parties. So do you focus more on the output, or do you focus on the process?
What is my preferred approach? My preferred approach is to focus on the process, but not a kind of a, what can we call it? A process that does not really allow for the parties to fully air their issues, their grievances, or does not help the parties get to a solution. I believe people come to mediation because they want a solution to their problem. If one simply says to them, hey, I'm here just to facilitate your interactions and so on, well, that's great. It might lead to some kind of a resolution, but I think parties deserve more. Now, let me just say this, that whatever I do, I need to do with the party's consent. So if they say, no, we just want you to facilitate, then that's all I do. So I would ask them, these are the different roles I can play. I can purely facilitate, hold the ring, and you sort it out. I can actually be bi-partial in a sense. In other words, help both of you look at your situation, help you negotiate more effectively, do some reality testing with you, or if the subject matter falls within my area of expertise, with your permission, maybe even provide a suggestion or two. So I think that is what mediators ought to do, is check with the parties, what do they want, and then see, can I help them? Am I equipped to shift gear, to change hats in the course of the process? But I think that I recently wrote something on the roles of mediators before, during, and after the negotiation phase. And I think what happens sometimes is that we use the initial part of the mediation as an intake process, just make sure all the formalities are ticked off, and then we put all the emphasis on the negotiation event, and then the deal is done and the parties have to make sure it's implemented. But I think mediators can play a major role in the pre-negotiation phase, helping the parties understand not just the process, but also what the process options are for them and what the role options are of a mediator, to make sure that everybody who has to be at the table is at the table, that the mandates are there, that there's a prior agenda of issues that the parties will have to prepare for. If there's further information or data that needs to be gathered, that has to be gathered up front, so that when the parties get to the negotiation event, the mediation process proper, that they are ready and fully prepared. And then the mediator can then say, right, now I'm no longer a process architect. I am now your mediator, and you've agreed that my role will be this or that, from very facilitative to far more evaluative, or something in between. And then when the matter is wrapped up, when the dispute has been resolved, let's then see what is needed to make this deal stick, to make this agreement work. And is there a role that the mediator can now play, no longer as a mediator, but as a facilitator to help with the implementation of the process? For example, there was a situation I was involved in where the parties, after they agreed on some protocols, asked me to remain involved for a short while to chair one or two meetings that were provided for in this protocol, just to get them used to implementing and applying what they'd agreed. So I think all of those roles are possible for mediators, not just a dispute resolution role, and then we get out of there and we carry on with the next case.
But do you think that at some point then there can be a blurring of the lines if you're not careful about, exactly your positionality with regards to this case? And if that is the case, then would that affect the process and the output or the outcome?
Remember, you do don't you risk, in other words, crossing some lines here? Everything happens with the consent of the parties. So no post-negotiation role for the mediator unless the parties agree that the person who mediated the dispute can now facilitate implementation. It has to happen with their consent. We did it often with collective bargaining disputes. There's a massive strike. The parties settle. Now what? They still have to work together. But the dispute sometimes resulted in more conflicts or old conflicts coming to the fore again. And you can't just say, right, the dispute is settled, now carry on with your lives. So very often the parties, the trade union and the employer would say, how can you help us rebuild relationships? So there were relationship building initiatives then often agreed between the parties post the mediation. It does not have to be the person who mediated the dispute, but there's nothing that prevents that because the parties give their consent. I also don't believe in the whole idea of mediator neutrality. I don't think we as humans can be neutral. You sit in a mediation and you think this one party is being completely unreasonable. Or, we say separate the people from the problem, but sometimes the person is the problem. You can't escape those thoughts and feelings, but what we can be is impartial, or some say bipartial. We are there for both parties. But clearly there are lines you cannot cross. You cannot cross the lines of confidentiality. There cannot be a conflict of interests. Those values, I think, are sacrosanct in mediation. But for the rest, the process, I think, is fluid.
Okay, so then how would you describe success in a mediation process? And for you, when has a mediation process been successful?
It's a difficult one. How would you describe a successful negotiation? I think, and what for me would be a success, I think for me what would be a successful outcome is if the parties are in a better position than they were before the mediation started. And ideally in a far better position, but that's not always possible. Sometimes they can just be slightly better off, and that's all one can maybe achieve in a mediation. But it also depends on what happens prior to the mediation. If one takes some time to help the parties set up the process, agree on the process and the rules for the process, you can also there help them define a common goal. What is the goal you're trying to reach? Let's agree on that's our goal here. What are the obstacles that might occur in the process? How will we deal with those? How, for example, will you deal with deadlock? What happens if there's deadlock? Parties might say, well, then we go to litigation. So, well, that absolutely is your right to do so. But how can this process help shorten the litigation process? Can we maybe combine mediation and arbitration, or mediation and litigation? So mediate, then litigate a legal issue, or send financial issues to an accountant or somebody to resolve, and then we get back into mediation. So that kind of flexibility is always there. But it's about what the parties see as their goal. And if they've reached their goal, that's a success. But it brings me to another thing that sometimes in mediation, relationship is important. People want to continue with the relationship, but they want the disputes resolved first so they can carry on with the relationship. But sometimes the relationship doesn't matter to them. Sometimes it's about solving an issue and walking away from the relationship. So success there can also mean different things. If they say we want to solve the dispute and have an ongoing relationship, then you've got to look at success on both sides. Was this the best solution? And how is the relationship beyond this process? What can you do to help them patch up their relationship? If the outcome, if it's a purely transactional kind of issue, a legal issue, for example, legal dispute that you try to mediate, the ongoing relationships might not be relevant at all. And then other success factors will apply. Ultimately, it's about mutual gain, not equal gain, but mutual gain, and preferably maximizing the gain that the parties can get out of the process.
Okay, so everything that you've said so far, and your reflections on your in terms of hindsight going back to 1990, 1980, you raised a very important point, and that was that one should be very careful about the context and be familiar with the cultural values, the nuance, etc. So that comes only, well, firstly from experience, secondly from wisdom, and maybe being, involved or embedded in particular communities or issues, but thirdly also through education. So do you believe that a mediator should possess, or what qualities do you believe a mediator should encompass? And should a mediator have specific training and experience in order to mediate a particular issue?
Okay, let me begin with the last one. Should a mediator have experience in a particular subject matter to mediate? Well, we often say to people we train, you don't have to be a subject matter expert to be a good mediator. And I still believe that's true. But there are exceptions. Sometimes there are issues that require specific knowledge. If the mediation is very much about figures, data, then you have to have the capacity to understand those. If it's about issues where a dispute where difficult legal issues are involved, or where there's a legislative framework that you operate within which you operate, then of course that knowledge is necessary. The difficulty for mediators, though, is that the parties themselves have their own perceptions about a mediator's competence. If you, for example, have lawyers involved in a dispute and you don't have any legal background, even though you're capable of mediating that dispute because there are no legal issues involved, their perception still might be, but you're not competent because you don't have the legal background. So that is an obstacle that mediators often face. I forgot another second part of your question. Actually, the first part of your question, which was that now?
Sorry, should mediators then have training?
Oh, yeah. Well, I always use this sort of PPP model, the people, process, and problem model of negotiation and mediation. So I think both negotiators and mediators need to have interpersonal skills. You have to be able to build rapport with the parties. If you don't have rapport, you're going to have a hard time helping them resolve their disputes. So there's a certain skills set there, social skills. Of course, there's the obvious stuff of good communication skills, asking questions, reframing, active listening, perspective seeking. Those are critical skills for both negotiators and mediators. So that for me is probably the most essential component. On top of that, there is issues such as integrity, the ability to build trust, and so on. Rapport, starting with rapport and eventually building trust in the parties. But there are process skills involved. And this is what we train people, right? How to manage the process. But I think mediators should also have a decent knowledge of negotiation, because what they are doing is they're helping the parties negotiate. So they need to understand how negotiation works, the dynamics of negotiation. They might be in a position where the parties consent to actually do some coaching for the parties. You might have a party who wants to table a certain proposal. You might think this is premature. I wouldn't do it now. Let's just hold back a little bit. We don't have enough information yet for you to come up with a proposal. So a good knowledge of negotiation, I think, is necessary. And then problem skills, creativity, problem solving, analytical skills, if it's necessary to understand the factual basis of a certain dispute and so on. So there's the different skills, I think, that are required. I think a lot of mediation processes or training only focus on the process aspect and little else. And I think that is a deficiency. Of course, on top of that comes cultural competences. There are courses on mediation, cultural competence training. So that's, I think, certainly part of a package as well.
So then,
or should be part of it.
Then, in your opinion, then what should be the selection criteria for being a leader in a mediation process? Because you're choosing the lead mediator now in the process, and you've mentioned all of these trainings that the mediator has to have. But then, in terms of the selection criteria, say if you were asked to choose a lead mediator, what would you be looking for?
I would look at the person's accreditation. Are they accredited somewhere by a credible institution? Because that usually would involve a kind of a selection process, not just being trained by, but being accredited by an institution, because that says, okay, you tick certain boxes, the criteria that people require for you to be accredited. It could be local or international accreditation. I think experience as a mediator, I think reputation, some sort of client feedback or party feedback would be useful to look at. And then based on that, the person's reputation, and if necessary, subject matter knowledge, if that is really required.
Now, you know that we have a very challenging environment when it comes to gender. And if you consider the patriarchal context of most conflict situations, whether it's the workplace that you negotiate in, or even on a more violent space, do you believe that women can be effective in mediating these situations? And have you mediated with or worked with women in mediation situations?
Absolutely, and excellent ones as well. And I'll tell you why I think women can do as good, or if not a better job than experienced male negotiators. I think, and of course this is generalizing, but the people I've worked with, both in a negotiation context and a mediation context, women I've worked with generally possess two key attributes. And that is let's call it the social skills, the social intuition, relationship building skills. Those are critical. In terms of people, problem, process, it's always people first. And if one possesses the skill to connect with people, if you have sufficient intuitive grasp of what's going on, you can read the room, and you possess a good measure of assertiveness as well, not aggressive assertiveness, but simply strong opinions or assertive behaviors. That is the perfect combination, I think, for negotiators and mediators. That mixture of relational skills and assertiveness. There's a lot of debate about, are these male or female skills? I don't think it's either. I think every negotiators, mediators need both, and these are things that can be trained. For some people, it's inherent, it's just part of their personality. But I think these are things that can be trained. One can be trained to be more assertive or less assertive. You can be trained in your relational skills, your intuitive feel for people and processes as well.
Okay, so with regards women and mediating different situations, do you think there is an acceptance, firstly, within the mediator, if I call it mediation family? So in other words, the entire cohort of mediators, are there now beginning to recognize the role that women can play in terms of effective mediation? So that's the first level. So that, if I may put it, as the top management, or the groups or the clubs of mediation. And then secondly, with people on the ground, do the people on the ground take kindly to female mediators, and then they're beginning to recognize the value and authoritativeness of a female mediator?
Do people recognize the value of female mediators? That's just a hard one for me to answer. What I can say is, in terms of acceptance of women as mediators, if I look at the people in my broader network, if I look at the people who are certified by the International Mediation Institute, if I look at the people trained by Center for Effective Dispute Resolution serving on their panel, or conflict dynamics in South Africa, if I look at the annual who's who of international commercial mediation, women feature very, very strongly. If you look at one of the major dispute resolution functions in an international organization with the International Monetary Fund, there's the Compliance Ombudsman's Office. Women occupy the top positions. So by and large, I don't sense that there's any sort of skepticism about women in this field. Quite the contrary. It may be different when it comes to political disputes, or when it's trying to mediate in certain cultural contexts. For example, I think in countries or cultures where there's a very strong male-oriented or paternalistic approach to matters, I'm not sure. I don't know how women mediators, as lead mediators, will fare. I don't know. I simply don't know. They may do well, but I think that the odds are stacked against them. They would have to work hard probably to win over the potential skepticism of the male-dominated dispute resolution environment that they operate in. But that's a guess. But in the world I live in, not at all. If I look at the work done by the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, Arbitration, so many of the commissioners are female and doing great, achieving great results in their mediation conciliation work as well. Also on the collective bargaining side, so not just individual disputes, but also with collective disputes. So from my vantage point, I don't see a reluctance to accept women as mediators at all.
Thank you for that. Now, the very important one is regarding obstacles or challenges, that one usually typically encounters during a mediation process. And you've done this now for close to 30 years. Do you document, each challenge or challenges, and then look at it and say, the next time you go into a similar situation, how am I going to deal with that? Is there a better way to handle this? Yeah. And how do you overcome these challenges?
Yeah. Do I engage in some kind of reflective practice? What did I learn? What can I do better? Always. Most of the time, mediation is an intense process. You have such a responsibility trying to help the parties resolve their problem that inevitably it creates concerns about one's own performance. How did it go? Especially if the matter did not settle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the mediator failed. It's the process that failed. And there could be different reasons why the process failed. Parties not prepared, not having a mandate, or having no intention to settle in the first place, just going through the motions. But I always do. I always, and maybe that's just my character as well, I always have some self-doubt. What did I do wrong? What could I have done better? But I think that's also good practice for negotiation and mediation, is always to reflect back to say, how did I do in terms of the people side, the relational side, my listening, my questions, my reframing, my handling of my own emotional triggers, which sometimes is a challenge for me. The process side of things, how did it go there? What did I learn? What I do ask myself sometimes before going in a process is, what can I do to completely mess up this process, and then try not to do it. And then lastly, in terms of the solution to the problem, was this the best solution? Were there other options? So I think that kind of bit of self-doubt is very useful for reflection and learning. And then to drop a list of saying, continue doing this and do more of this and do less of that. I think that's good practice for any negotiator or mediator. Yeah.
So anecdotally, do you have anything that you can share with us in terms of like real obstacles or challenges that you encountered during a mediation process, and then how you overcame these?
Yeah. Real obstacles, how did I overcome it? I think the first one is always to gain the party's acceptance if they don't know you. I had one dispute. There was a strike that had turned violent, which I had to try and mediate. And when I arrived at the company premises, the union, one of the senior shop stewards came to me, confronted me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the mediator." "Prove it," he says. I said, "What do you mean, prove it?" He says, "What's your name?" I gave him my name. He said, "Prove it. Show me your identity." I said, so it was a major battle for some reason, just to let this person understand I am the mediator that the union and the company has agreed to use. So that took some time to not necessarily get that person's trust, but at least get him to accept that it's me who will do the mediation. That may well be that racial factors played a role. Mistrust on each part of somebody with a white skin, for example, that could have been it. But I think eventually we got over that, and the matter was resolved. But so sometimes just establishing a connection, a rapport with the people can be very, very difficult. The second problem is if there are lawyers involved in mediations and they're not themselves trained in mediation or have a good understanding of mediation, then things can go horribly wrong, because they very often adopt on behalf of their clients, and maybe sometimes because of their clients, an either or approach. And becomes competitive. Whereas somebody who understands mediation may well be competitive on certain aspects, but will also try to find a solution through joint problem solving with the other party, with the help of the mediator. So having the wrong people involved in the dispute is another one. The third one, as I already mentioned, is sometimes the people are the problem. There was a family dispute, business dispute that I managed once, which for me was the worst ever, where the relationship between members of the family was so poor, and mainly because one of the protagonists had serious psychological issues. And in that situation, there's little you can do. The person needed help, because the person was the main catalyst for the conflict that the family had got drawn into. And there was no settlement of the dispute. And there was also no way of removing this person from the process, because he was a main player in the entire dispute. So those for me are some of the major obstacles that I've come across.
Okay, so as a last question then, before I let you go, do you believe that there is something like an African mediation or an African mediation approach? And how would you describe that?
Oh, absolutely. Is there something like an African mediation approach? Absolutely. I think the training that's out there for, say, commercial mediators in particular is very much Western oriented. Okay, we look at disputes as singular events involving two or more parties. I think from a more I don't want to just call it African, but from a collectivist perspective, a dispute is not necessarily something between you and me. It is something that can have a broader reach, and it has a ripple effect. That means that to resolve this dispute, we may have to enlist the help of others, a collective, to a wise counsel to help us with this particular conflict, because of the longer term effect of your and my conflict on this community of ours. And this is, by the way, where we can learn a lot from primates. A lot's been written on natural conflict resolution among primates. Chimpanzees, for example, after a massive fight between males, a lot of time, weeks are sometimes spent on calming everybody down, getting relationships back in track, grooming each other, in order to try and avoid further conflicts arising, at least for a while. So I think our perception of a conflict and dispute is different from a Western orientation than it is from a more African orientation. I can give you, if I may, just give you an example. Somebody I worked with told me a story, this was in the 1990s, about a dispute they had settled in the 1980s. Or sorry, they were two very senior people from the Legal Resources Center in Johannesburg at the time, or from Wits. One was Arthur Chaskelson, who became the Chief Justice. The other was a guy called Paul Pretorius. He's still active at the bar. And they had been asked by a community to sue the state for damages because of certain members of the community having been shot by police during a protest action. So, being very time-oriented, they apparently arrived at the village outside Hammanskraal, I think, where the community was, and they decided we need to be there at 10 o'clock, so they left Johannesburg early enough. They had to be back at their practices at 2 in the afternoon or something, so they thought enough time for consultation. And Paul, who told me this story, he says by 12 o'clock we were still sitting in a shack waiting to be called. We could see the men gathered under a tree. Somebody was sitting there slightly elevated. The others were sitting on the ground or on their haunches. And he said, we were getting worried. So we called back to the office and said, look, or had a call made from a local phone there. We won't be back, just clear our calendars for the day. And he said about 1 o'clock, somebody got up from the group and came to fetch them. Now they could start talking. And then they asked, but what was going on here? Why were you discussing all of this? So they were told that what the community was worried about is that if they won the case, what would happen to the compensation? How would that be handled? Because they didn't want further disputes or disputes arising within the community because of money suddenly coming into the community. So they first settled the rules for the future engagement before they actually started talking to the advocates about the case itself. Now, there's a wisdom to that, looking at the longer term consequences of things rather than just focusing on the short time. And of course, then this is a collective problem. Let's try to decide together on how to tackle it. So yes, I think there is a difference. But of course, you can't settle all disputes like that, right? If it's a commercial dispute, you can't do it that way.
No, you can't. But definitely that is something that I think many of us we forget about, or I suppose if you look at in terms of Western mediators, then they're not really attuned to the nuances of community structure. And yes. So this is very, very important. Thank you very much for these wonderful insights, Barney.
Thanks for reaching out. I appreciate it. And that will the research be made available at some point?
Yes. So last thing, you said you've written quite a bit.
Yes.
Is your material available, accessible? How do we access what you've written?
It should be usually there's a thing called academia. I think you might find some of it there. I recently wrote a book that's only available from the publishers, unfortunately. But that's mostly negotiation, dispute resolution for lawyers, and quite a bit piece there on the role of lawyers, of mediators. I can send you something just on the different roles that mediators can play. That's going to be published soon, so I can send that to you as well through Yamkela. And yeah, so, and if there's anything else that you see that you can't get access to that I've written, let me know. I'll see if I can find a copy for you.
No, that'll be wonderful. Thank you so much. And you're open to us reaching out to you again in the future, right?
Anytime. You're more than welcome. Good luck with the project.
Thank you, Barney. Have a good day.